In this video, I'm going to walk you through just some of the key parts of SPSS that we will spend most of our time in during the course of the semester, as well as some of the key areas that you're going to use as you move through your research and analysis course sequence. I'd say the very first place to start when you look at the SPSS window is to talk about the two views that you have. So if you look down here at the bottom left, currently we're in data view. This is the view where you would see whatever variables we define, which we'll talk about in a second, and each case. And this is the part where you would enter your data once you have some to enter. Down here at the bottom, if you click this little tab called variable view, this is the window in which you would name your variables, which we'll do in a few moments. And we'll talk about some of the very basic aspects of naming variables in SPSS, and we'll talk about what the rest of these columns mean. So a couple of quick things to walk through. If we go up to File, you'll see a similar menu as you would in other programs. If you go to New, you can open new data sheets. Syntax is something you may get into a little later in your research and analysis. This would be where you actually use some coding to program SPSS to do certain things that it doesn't do necessarily well by point and click. You can also open new output windows. If you have saved data or output, you can open it through this function, the open function. If you are someone who, or your instructor is someone who uses other data sets that come from different programs, especially Excel, notice that you can import directly from Excel, and it has options of how you wish to bring labels in and things like that, so it makes it fairly easy. You'll have all of your save functions and save as everyone I'm sure is familiar with. You would be able to export your information in many different formats to be used in different ways if you wish. And honestly, for the rest of this, I think this is stuff that you would rarely use. As we move through edit, the handy undo and redo functions, that's pretty nice. You can also search and find cases like you normally would in other programs, so that's a good thing. View, depending on what you like to see in your or what your preferences are in your data in your SPSS program, you can modify things around. Like you can be able to see different parts of, like you can take away the bar, and you can take away your grid lines in your data sheet. That's really up to you. You probably won't spend too much time in there. You will spend some time in the data menu. A couple of key things that I know that you would likely use. If you go down and you can see sort cases, you can sort your data set. So if you wanted to sort it by one variable, you would go in and sort it. You can sort it from high to low, low to high, A to Z, etc. You can transpose data, so if you have data that is in a horizontal, organized horizontally, you can use this transpose function and flip it vertically, those kinds of things. You can bring files together. That might be something that your instructor uses, depending on how they run their course. One that I find quite useful is the select cases function. So if you go into select cases, essentially this is a way to turn on a filter. So in a situation where you might have 3 groups, but you only want to focus on 2 of them, you can go into data, select cases, and turn on a filter so that you only you only keep active the 2 groups you're interested in. So that's something that can be very useful, and you would likely use as part of your research and analysis course sequence. Weight cases is something that you might find interesting as an example, or might find useful depending on what you're doing in your classes. As an example, You might want to run a chi-square analysis where you want to weight your cases by the frequencies that you have in different categories, and that would set your chi-square up to lead you to pretty accurate data based on the weighting by frequencies. So again, I'd say the most common one here would be sort cases and select cases, and I think those are quite useful. In the transform, I'm sure that you would likely use this quite frequently. The first one that you come to is the compute variable function. This is a situation where you tell SPSS how to compute a new variable given existing variables in your data set. So as an example, let's say that I have the raw score from an exam in terms of total points earned, and I know that the total points possible were 120. And so if I wanted to use the transform compute variable function to tell SPSS to compute the percent, I can go into compute variable and put in the formula for doing that computation. So for instance, I'd tell SPSS take each value in the raw score column, divide it by 120, and then multiply it by 100 so that it creates a new variable that is entitled the percent. So that's a very useful thing that you don't have to do all this by hand. Recoding, this would be a situation where you have your data in one particular structure in your data set and you want to change it, and rather than having to re-enter it all by hand, you can do this on the front end. So for instance, as an example, if I have a survey in which some of the let's say you have a Likert scale that is from strongly disagree on up to strongly agree, and those values need to be reverse scored for certain questions in your survey as part of your validity checks. You can go into recode, and wherever you see a 1, you can make it equal to a 5. Wherever you see a 2, you can make it equal to a 4, and vice versa, so that the numbers are accurately reflecting what you intended to ask in those questions. And you can recode them into the same variables and just change existing ones, or you can create new ones. Analyze, you will spend quite a bit of time in here. As you'll note, you'll start off in descriptive statistics. Here you can get frequency analysis, basic descriptive statistics. You can use the explore function, which will give you very detailed descriptive statistics, as well as easily producing histograms, QQ plots or quantile plots, and hypothesis testing for normality automatically come in here. Compare means is someplace you'll spend quite a lot of time. You can compute means of your data set. You can do all of your t-tests through here, your single sample, independent samples t-test, and your paired samples t-test. This is also one way that you can access a one-way analysis of variance. Depending on your instructor, this might be the way that you do this. There are multiple ways. So down here in general linear model is another way that you can conduct your analysis of variance. So you have univariate options where you have single dependent measure, multivariate where you have multiple, and repeated measures where you're tracking over time. Correlation, so if you are going to be running a basic two measured variable correlation, your bivariate option would be here. If you're going to use a partial correlation, which you might, which is a very simple regression-like procedure where you have two variables that you're interested in examining the relationship, and you want to statistically control for another potentially related variable. If you get into regression, you'll spend some time in the regression menu, basic linear regression, but you can also use curve estimation, which is a nice function to talk about what kind of curve best fits your data. So that might be something you get into. Probably later in your time in research and analysis, you would get into non-parametric tests. These are situations where your parametric tests, like your mean, your independent t-tests, your paired t-tests, your single sample t-tests, your one-way analysis of variance, and other analysis of variance procedures. If you don't meet the statistical assumptions set in those, you might choose a non-parametric test that doesn't make those sort of assumptions. And so you can do this for single sample, independent, and paired samples. Graphs. There are multiple ways to make graphs in SPSS. Some instructors like to use the chart builder function, where you get to see a visual depiction of what you're telling SPSS to do. You can also do a legacy dialogues, which allows you to, I would say, in greater detail, plan out what it is that you're trying to plot. For many purposes in your research and analysis courses, the chart builder probably does all that you would need to do. So in this case, let's go back, making sure that we are in variable view, just to talk about how we would enter a variable with some, and then put in some numbers, and then I'll end this video so that I keep it short. So let's say down here in the bottom left, we're going to stay in variable view, and let's say I want to enter in some data on some scores, hypothetically, of an exam. So in your name of the first cell here, we're going to type in scores. A couple of hints about SPSS. When naming variables, it does not like to have spaces. It does not like for you to start with numbers. And so what you'll need to do is name this in such a way that it's clear to you and you know what it means, while staying within those parameters. So using symbols and things like that, SPSS is not going to like. If you do happen to like using spaces in your variable names, you can use the underscore function. So if I wanted to say exam scores, I could use exam underscore scores, and that would work just fine for SPSS. In this column of type, you'll see an option for picking what type of variable you have, and if you click on the little blue box, it gives you the option to define it. In this case, we're going to use numeric and their scores, but if, for instance, you had a string of letters and numbers for your variable, you can click on string and define how many characters it might be. Likely, you'll spend most of your time in numeric or string. And we can hit OK. Width, how many numbers are we talking about, or how many characters in the information you're going to enter? And do you need decimals? In this case, I'm not going to use decimals, so if you click on decimals, you can move it down to 0. And values, we'll talk about that in just a moment when I talk about if we're going to separate it up into groups. If you have any missing data, if you click on this, you can tell SPSS what your missing values would be. And that's something you might use in your classes. Over here at measure, everyone should know what scale of measurement your variable would be on. Just as you click on this, you're going to have 3 options. Noting that scale will include both interval and ratio scales in SPSS. Ordinal would be your ranked data, or your Likert scale data. Nominal would be your categorical situations, and we'll note that when we create some groups. So in this case, our exam scores are going to fall under scale. So once we have defined all aspects of the variable we want to enter, we go back to data view, and I have a list of 10 scores here that I'm going to enter. And so once you click on it, you just type it in and go down to the next cell. Okay, so here are our 10 scores, and we entered these in data view. Now, let's imagine the situation where I had 2 classes of exam scores that I wanted to enter and examine. So if I had 2 groups, and I pulled in 10 more scores from another class, but I'm going to go back to variable view, and I'm going to go to my second variable, and I'm going to name this class. And in this case, we're going to use numeric because I want to show you what the values column will do for you. We'll keep the width as it is. We do not need decimal places because in this variable what we're doing is defining our groups. Over on values, if you click on values, I'm going to use 1s and 2s to define arbitrarily my groups, noting that this is going to be a nominal scale or categorical, where a 1 and a 2 really don't carry any other meaning except to separate these groups. So if I type in 1, and I'm going to make that the morning class. So in label, I'm going to say morning, and I can put morning class just to be clear, and click add. And I go back to my other value and click 2, and this is going to be my afternoon class. And I'm going to add. And so by doing this, what it's going to allow me to do is when I'm in data view, I only have to type in 1s and 2s to define which group each individual in the class is in, rather than having to use morning, afternoon as a string variable. So you hit OK here, go on over and click this scale of measurement, and note that it is nominal. Right? So in this case, if I go back to data view, here you should see that class variable that we're going to define our groups, and these particular scores here were all from the morning group, morning class, so I'm going to label those all as 1. Then I have 10 more scores for group 2, so I'm going to take my 2s all the way down to 20, and then I will enter those in. And those are my scores for the 2 classes. What this does is allows you to structure things in an independent way. So group 1 is different than group 2, and this is the basic structure for a between groups comparison later on that you would get to later on in the class. But mainly the take-home message here is to make sure that you understand the basic layout of SPSS, know what to do in data view and variable view in setting up your variables. And then the final thing I want to make sure we're all on the same page with is to go to File. We're going to save as. And I'm going to save this data set like I would any file. I'm going to put SPSS intro demo. I'll put the date on it. That's always a good way to label your information so you know when it was created. That becomes increasingly important as you work with data, especially in experimental situations. And we'll save this, and then that will allow me to show you what you would see in an output window. So your output window, whenever you have an SPSS file open, will be a complete record of everything that you do. So you'll note that the first thing we did with these data was save it, and it'll tell you saved it as this using this path on the computer. So that way you know where it is. And then everything after this, so if I were to run some basic descriptive statistics, you would get to see all of that output here, and it'll keep a complete record of how you programmed it in, so that you always know and can go back and check your work. And we'll do that in a future video.